Azariah Hughes wiped a streak of black grease across his forehead, staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. Exactly 72 hours separated his family's century-old farm from the auction block, and a freak massive autumn weather system was rapidly bearing down on the valley. While his wealthy neighbors paraded their $500,000 satellite-guided, climate-controlled behemoths across the county roads, Azariah stood alone in a desolate scrapyard, staring at a rusted, rat-infested relic he had just purchased for exactly $40. The local equipment dealer had laughed directly in his face, calling the gutted machine a coffin on wheels. By the end of the week, nobody in Oakhaven County would be laughing. Azariah Hughes tasted the bitter grit of pulverized topsoil in the back of his throat. It was early October in Oakhaven County, a time that usually brought the crisp, hopeful scent of autumn and the promise of a bountiful harvest. This year, however, it brought nothing but suffocating heat and the suffocating weight of generational debt. The Hughes farm, sprawling across 800 acres of rolling Midwestern terrain, had been bleeding money for 5 consecutive seasons. Between unpredictable droughts, skyrocketing fertilizer costs, and international tariffs that slashed soybean prices, Azariah was fighting a losing war. The final, devastating blow had arrived just 3 days prior. Azariah had been running his only harvester, a tired 25-year-old machine held together by zip ties, sheer willpower, and aftermarket belts. Midway through the North Quarter, a worn bearing had overheated, throwing a shower of bright orange sparks into a nest of dry chaff. Within 3 minutes, the machine was an inferno. Azariah had barely escaped the cab before the fuel lines ruptured, sending a pillar of thick black smoke into the sky. He had stood at the edge of the field, the fire extinguisher empty in his blistered hands, watching the only thing standing between his family and bankruptcy melt into a charred, unrecognizable skeleton of twisted steel. There was no insurance money coming. He had been forced to let the policy lapse 6 months earlier, just to afford the spring seed. Desperation had driven him into town the following morning. He sat in the sterile, air-conditioned office of Richard Cole, the senior loan officer at First National of Oakhaven. Cole, a man whose hands had never known the sting of a cracked blister, sat behind a sprawling mahogany desk, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I'm sorry, Azariah," Cole had said, his voice dripping with a practiced, hollow sympathy. "The bank's risk assessment algorithms are completely rigid. You're over-leveraged. We can't extend your line of credit for a replacement machine. In fact, if this crop isn't harvested and sold by the end of the month to cover your arrears, we will have no choice but to initiate foreclosure proceedings." Azariah had walked out of the bank with a hollow ringing in his ears. Driven by a blind, desperate hope, he had driven his battered pickup truck to Croft Implement and Tractor, the premier dealership in the county. The lot was a sea of gleaming, flawless, green and yellow machinery. Harrison Croft, the owner of the dealership, was holding court near a brand-new $500,000 John Deere X9 combine. Harrison was a third-generation dealer who wore crisp, branded polo shirts and looked at struggling farmers like Azariah as if they were a nuisance on his balance sheets. He was currently laughing with Thomas Sterling, the wealthiest mega-farmer in the region, who farmed 10,000 acres and rotated his fleet every 2 years. Azariah approached them, his boots leaving faint trails of dust on the pristine showroom floor. He swallowed his pride and asked Harrison if there was anything on the back lot. A trade-in, a lease return, anything he could finance on a short-term, high-interest handshake deal. Harrison had stopped smiling. He looked Azariah up and down, taking in the frayed denim and the soot still stained into the creases of Azariah's hands. "Azariah, let's be realistic," Harrison scoffed, his voice loud enough for several other customers to hear. "Richard Cole at the bank already called me. He told me your credit is basically dust. I sell precision agricultural technology, not miracles. I can't let a $250,000 machine roll off this lot based on your hopes and prayers. Farming is a corporate game now. You're trying to play it with wooden nickels." Thomas Sterling chuckled, turning his back to inspect the X9's touchscreen display. The humiliation burned hotter in Azariah's chest than the combine fire had. With nowhere else to turn, Azariah drove to the edge of the county line, pulling into Earl Miller's scrap and salvage. The yard was a graveyard of industrial decay, acres of crushed cars, rusted beams, and forgotten machinery baking under the unforgiving sun. Earl, a man who perpetually chewed on an unlit cigar, led Azariah through a labyrinth of twisted metal to the very back fence. There, half sunk into the mud and overgrown with aggressive briar vines, sat the remains of an ancient machine. It was an old Gleaner combine from the late 1970s. It was a terrifying sight. The engine block was missing entirely. The cab glass was shattered. The augers were heavily rusted, and a family of raccoons had made a sprawling nest inside the grain tank. It was little more than a galvanized steel carcass waiting for the crusher. "It's been sitting here since Clinton was in office," Earl muttered, kicking a flattened tire. "Mostly gutted. Sent the motor to a guy in Nebraska 10 years ago. It's just scrap weight now." Azariah stared at the rusted husk. He didn't see a pile of trash. He saw a frame. He saw heavy, forged steel from an era before computer chips and plastic sensors ruled the fields. He saw the bare skeletal geometry of a machine that, at its core, only had to do one thing: separate grain from stalk. "How much for the weight, Earl?" Azariah asked, his voice dead flat. Earl scratched his neck. "Tell you what. You haul it out of here so I don't have to pay my guy to cut it up. Give me $40 and we'll call it even." Azariah reached into his wallet, pulled out 2 crumpled $20 bills and handed them over. He had just bought his salvation, or his tombstone. When Azariah towed the hulking, screeching mass of rusted metal up his gravel driveway behind his heavy-duty flatbed, his wife Claire stepped out onto the porch. She wiped her hands on her apron, the screen door slamming shut behind her. She didn't scream, and she didn't throw anything. Her silent, wide-eyed stare as she looked at the $40 pile of jagged, decaying iron was far more devastating. "Azariah," she whispered as he stepped out of the truck. "What is that?" "That," Azariah said, his eyes burning with a manic, sleepless intensity, "is our harvest." Over the next 2 weeks, the Hughes barn became a theater of absolute mechanical madness. Azariah had a secret weapon that Harrison Croft and the bank's algorithms couldn't account for. Before he had returned to take over the failing family farm, Azariah had spent 4 years earning a degree in heavy mechanical engineering. He understood the profound physics of kinetic energy, fluid dynamics, and rotational torque. He didn't just need to repair the old machine. He had to entirely reinvent it. The first hurdle was the power plant. The old combine had no engine. Azariah scoured the local classifieds and found a wrecked 1990s Peterbilt semi-truck that had rolled over in a ditch. For a few $100s of his remaining cash, he bought the salvaged Cummins N14 diesel engine out of it. It was a colossal, heavy-duty motor designed to pull 80,000 pounds of freight down a highway, not run a delicate agricultural threshing system. The engine was far too large for the combine's original chassis, working under the blinding blue arc of a welding torch night after night. Azariah used a plasma cutter to surgically sever the rear frame of the combine. He scavenged heavy I-beams from an abandoned railway bridge down the road, welding a completely custom, reinforced cradle to hold the massive Cummins block. But the true genius and the true risk lay in the threshing cylinder. Modern combines relied on delicate computer-adjusted rotors, incredibly sensitive to moisture. If the crop was wet, the computers would sense the resistance and throttle the machine down, or shut it off entirely to prevent belt snapping. Azariah threw all modern conventions out the window. He remembered a notebook his grandfather had kept in the attic, a series of sketches for a custom, aggressive rotor design that the major manufacturers had deemed too violently efficient and prone to breaking standard drive belts. Azariah decided to build it. He stripped the original rusted rotor bare. Using hardened steel plates salvaged from broken bulldozer blades, he fabricated a massive, chevron-patterned threshing cylinder. It was twice the weight of a standard rotor. To power it, he abandoned the idea of rubber belts, which would simply disintegrate under the torque of the semi-truck engine. Instead, he connected the main drive pulley to the threshing mechanism using heavy-duty, industrial steel roller chains, the kind used in lumber mills. There were no microchips. There were no moisture sensors. There were no safety limiters. There was only raw, direct mechanical transfer of brute force. Word of Azariah's desperate project spread through Oakhaven like a wildfire. Neighbors whispered about Hughes's folly. One humid Tuesday afternoon, Harrison Croft's immaculate Ford F250 rolled slowly down the county road, coming to a halt near Azariah's open barn doors. Harrison rolled down his tinted window, a smirk plastered across his face. He pulled out his smartphone, leaning out to snap a photograph of the monstrosity. The combine was a patchwork nightmare of faded galvanized steel, bright red bridge supports, and the soot-stained black Cummins engine protruding awkwardly from the rear. "Making a modern art piece for the county fair, Azariah?" Harrison shouted over the hiss of Azariah's welding torch. "I hear the scrap yard is doing a buyback program. Might want to cut your losses before that thing vibrates itself into shrapnel. Azariah flipped up his welding mask, the glow of the hot slag illuminating his exhausted, soot-covered face. He looked at Harrison, then back to his machine. "You should get off my property, Harrison." Harrison chuckled, putting his phone in his pocket. By evening, the photo was posted on the Oak Haven Agricultural Exchange Facebook group. The comments poured in, dozens of laughing emojis and mocking comments from the local farmers who were secure in their climate-controlled, warranty-backed machines. But the laughter abruptly stopped on Thursday evening when the local meteorologist broke in over the radio broadcasts. A massive, unseasonal superstorm system was stalling over the plains. A wall of heavy rain, high winds, and plummeting temperatures was precisely 72 hours away. Any crops left in the fields when the storm hit would be flattened, soaked, and entirely destroyed. The harvest window had just slammed shut. It was a race against time. The air across Oak Haven County turned thick, heavy, and bruised with a sickly purple hue. The humidity spiked, creating a stifling, oppressive atmosphere that made the very air feel like a damp wool blanket. Panic swept through the valley. The county roads were suddenly choked with the roar of diesel engines as every farmer scrambled to deploy their fleets. Harrison Croft's dealership was operating around the clock. His service trucks were flying down the highways, carrying emergency parts and software technicians to keep his wealthy clients' sophisticated machines running at maximum capacity. At the Hughes farm, the tension was suffocating. Claire stood by the barn door, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, watching as Azariah climbed into the cab of his creation. The cab had no doors. The original seat had rotted away, so Azariah sat strapped into a torn leather captain's chair, salvaged from a rusted-out conversion van. The dashboard was a chaotic mess of exposed wiring, analog pressure gauges, and a massive, heavy-duty throttle lever he had machined himself. Azariah turned the ignition key, engaging the glow plugs. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly, and pressed the heavy starter button. For a terrifying second, there was only the high-pitched whine of the starter motor fighting the immense compression of the heavy-duty semi-truck engine. Then, with a concussive blast that shook the dust from the barn rafters, the Cummins N14 detonated into life. It belched a thick plume of black exhaust out of a straight-pipe exhaust stack, rattling the remaining glass in the barn windows. It sounded absolutely demonic. It didn't purr like the modern, muffled John Deere engines. It possessed a violent, rhythmic, ground-shaking thrum, a mechanical heartbeat of pure, unfiltered torque. Azariah grabbed the custom linkage levers and engaged the massive steel chains. The sound escalated into a terrifying metallic shriek, then settled into a deep, aggressive roar as the heavy, bulldozer steel rotor began to spin. The entire machine vibrated with a terrifying, muscular tension. He drove it out of the barn, the massive tires biting into the dirt, and headed straight for his largest soybean field. The conditions were arguably the worst possible scenario for harvesting. Because of the extreme humidity and the approaching storm front, the moisture content of the crop had spiked to nearly 22%. The stalks were rubbery, damp, and incredibly tough. It was the exact type of condition that caused modern, high-speed machines to choke, forcing them to crawl at a snail's pace to avoid snapping belts and clogging their delicate internal rotors. 2 miles away, on the vast acreage of Thomas Sterling's farm, the crisis was already unfolding. Sterling's fleet of brand-new $500,000 X9s had hit the damp fields. Within 20 minutes, the disaster struck. The highly sensitive internal computer systems detected the immense strain of the damp, rubbery stalks entering the threshing chambers. The software, designed to protect the expensive internal components from catastrophic damage, immediately threw error codes across the touchscreens. Warning, rotor overload risk, threshing system disengaged. Sterling screamed into his CB radio as his fleet of green giants ground to a halt, their alarms blaring. The software limiters were throttling the engines and refusing to let the machines process the wet crop. They were completely paralyzed by their own protective coding. Harrison Croft's phone began to ring incessantly as his top clients demanded software overrides that didn't exist. Back on the Hughes farm, Azariah aligned his $40 Frankenstein machine with the first rows of his damp crop. He gripped the heavy steel steering wheel, gritted his teeth, and shoved the throttle lever all the way forward. The Cummins engine howled, pouring black smoke into the grey sky. He hit the stalks. Azariah braced himself for the sickening sound of metal snapping, or the engine choking out under the immense load. But the machine didn't choke. It didn't even hesitate. The custom, grandfather-designed chevron rotor, spinning with the unyielding, unthrottled power of a heavy-duty highway truck engine, hit the damp soybeans like a chainsaw hitting butter. There were no computer sensors to tell the machine it was working too hard. The heavy steel chains transferred every ounce of kinetic energy directly into the threshing cylinder. The unique, aggressive geometry of the rotor didn't just strip the pods, it created a massive internal vacuum effect, grabbing the tough, wet material and violently shattering it through the concaves. The stalks were pulverized and violently expelled out the back in a shredded mist, while the golden, separated grain began to pour into the holding tank in a torrential, unstoppable waterfall. Azariah checked his speed. He wasn't just harvesting, he was flying. He was cutting through the impossible conditions at nearly 6 miles per hour, double the speed of a normal machine in perfect conditions. The CB radio mounted on his makeshift dashboard began to crackle with static. Panic from other farmers was bleeding over the open channels. "I've got 3 machines down. The computers keep shutting the headers off," a voice panicked. "Croft, answer your damn phone. The software won't let us process this wet garbage," yelled another. Then a different voice cut through the static, hesitant and bewildered. It was Old Man Henderson, whose property bordered Azariah's. "Hey, anybody else out on County Road 9? You all seeing what I'm seeing? Hughes is out here. He's in that scrapyard thing he built." Henderson paused, the crackle of the radio filling the silence. "Boys, he's not just moving, he's absolutely chewing that field to dust. He's filling a grain cart every 20 minutes. Across the county, the mocking laughter finally died, replaced by the terrifying, echoing roar of a rusted $40 ghost machine tearing through the fields. Harrison Croft's pristine, climate-controlled dealership had devolved into an absolute war zone. The polished showroom floors, usually a place of hushed, high-dollar negotiations and firm handshakes, were now vibrating with the angry shouts of desperate men. Outside, the sky was a bruised, swirling canopy of charcoal and sickly yellow, a terrifying reminder that the superstorm was now less than 48 hours from devastating Oak Haven County. Thomas Sterling, whose immaculate fleet of $500,000 X9s was currently paralyzed across 10,000 acres of wet soybeans, burst through the double-glass doors of Harrison's office. He didn't bother to knock. His face was flushed crimson, and for the first time in his life his designer boots were caked in heavy wet mud. "Unlock them!" Sterling roared, slamming a thick fist down on Harrison's mahogany desk. "I don't care what your warranty department says, Harrison. I have millions of dollars of unharvested crop out there, and your machines are sitting in the mud flashing warning codes like a string of cheap Christmas lights. Give me the override codes." Harrison, usually a picture of corporate arrogance, looked genuinely terrified. He wiped a bead of nervous sweat from his temple. "Thomas, you have to understand the physics of the situation. The moisture content of the stalks has surpassed 24%. If I bypass the safety algorithms and force those rotors to spin through that rubbery mass, the serpentine belts will snap in seconds. If the belts don't snap, the internal concaves will warp. You'll destroy the machines." "They are already useless," Sterling shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the window. "If that storm hits, the crop rots. I lose 20 times what those machines are worth. I am paying for performance, Croft, not a $500,000 paperweight with a touchscreen." "There is nothing I can do," Harrison pleaded, gesturing to his ringing phone. "It's the software. It's hard-coded by the manufacturer to prevent catastrophic mechanical failure. No modern combine in the world can process stalks this wet without choking." A slow, agonizing silence settled over the office, broken only by the persistent ringing of the telephone. Then one of Harrison's lead service technicians, a young man named Davis who had been monitoring the local agricultural radio frequencies, stepped into the doorway. "Mr. Croft, Mr. Sterling," Davis said, his voice hesitant. "That's not entirely accurate. Somebody is harvesting right now, at full speed." Sterling turned, his eyes narrowing. "Who? The entire county is at a standstill." "It's Azariah Hughes," Davis replied, holding up his portable radio. The static-laced chatter of bewildered farmers was bleeding from the speaker. "He's running that scrap build of his on County Road 9. They're saying he's chewing through 50 acres an hour." Harrison let out a short, incredulous laugh. "That's impossible. That rusted piece of garbage would have rattled itself to pieces the second it hit wet crop. It's a suicide rig." "I'm telling you, boss, Davis insisted, looking out the window toward the northern horizon. Half the county is parked on the shoulder watching him do it. Out on the Hughes farm, Azariah was entirely consumed by the sensory overload of his creation. There was no soundproof cab, no air conditioning, and no satellite-guided auto-steer. There was only the deafening, bone-rattling roar of the salvage yard Cummins N14 engine, roaring at 2,000 revolutions per minute. He wore heavy-duty industrial earmuffs and safety goggles to protect his eyes from the violent storm of dust, chaff, and diesel smoke swirling around him. His arms ached with the sheer physical effort of holding the heavy, unassisted steering wheel steady as the massive, mismatched tires dug deep into the damp earth. But as he looked out over the header, a wild, euphoric grin broke through the thick layer of soot on his face. The machine was an absolute monster. Every time it encountered a dense, wet patch of soybeans, the exact kind of patch that would cause a modern John Deere to throw an error code and shut down. The massive diesel engine didn't even drop a decibel. The heavy-duty steel roller chains, stripped from an old lumber mill, refused to slip. They transferred every ounce of the engine's monstrous torque directly to the custom-forged chevron rotor. The threshing cylinder wasn't delicately rubbing the grain from the stalks. It was executing a violent, blunt-force trauma on the crop. The immense kinetic energy of the heavy steel plates shattered the rubbery, wet stalks on impact, forcing them through the wide-set concaves while the grain cascaded perfectly into the holding tank. The machine was so heavy, and the spinning inertia of the rotor was so massive that it possessed a mechanical momentum no software could ever replicate. Azariah reached the end of a long pass, hauled back on the heavy hydraulic levers, and pivoted the roaring beast around. As he swung the machine to face the next rows, he noticed something strange along the perimeter of his field. A line of pickup trucks had parked along the gravel shoulder of County Road 9. Men in muddy boots were standing in the beds of their trucks, leaning against the wire fences, pointing and staring in absolute disbelief. These were the same men who had populated the Facebook group with laughing emojis just 48 hours ago. Now they were watching a $40 junkyard relic defy the laws of modern agricultural physics, processing wet, stubborn crops at a speed that defied logic. Azariah didn't wave. He didn't gloat. He simply slammed the heavy mechanical throttle lever forward, dropped the header back into the damp crop, and let the Cummins engine howl as he plunged back into the green sea. He had a farm to save, and the clock was ticking down to zero. By twilight, the sky had turned a malicious, churning black. The wind had picked up, howling across the flat plains and carrying the distinct metallic scent of impending rain. The temperature was dropping fast. The superstorm was no longer a distant threat on a radar screen. It was a physical wall of darkness consuming the western horizon. Azariah engaged the crude, massive halogen work lights he had bolted to the front of the combine's frame. They cast harsh, blindingly bright arcs of light into the swaying soybeans, illuminating the swirling dust in a chaotic dance. He was exhausted. His hands were blistered beneath his heavy leather gloves, and his spine felt compressed from the relentless vibration of the rigid steel chassis. But his grain carts were full. In a single, grueling 12-hour shift, his Frankenstein machine had cleared nearly 600 acres. The Hughes farm was safe. The bank would be paid. He pulled the massive rig alongside his waiting semi-truck trailer, engaging the unloading auger. The golden soybeans poured out in a heavy, satisfying rush. As he throttled the engine down to idle, he finally felt the immense crushing weight of the past 5 years begin to lift from his shoulders. It was then that a pair of brilliant LED headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the swirling dust around the unloading zone. A sleek black luxury pickup truck pulled off the dirt path and parked just yards away from Azariah's tractor. The door opened and Thomas Sterling stepped out. The wealthy mega-farmer looked entirely out of his element. His hair was disheveled, his expensive jacket was zipped tight against the biting wind, and his eyes were wide as he stared up at the roaring, rusted, fire-spitting beast that Azariah had built. Sterling walked slowly toward the combine, flinching as a rogue spark shot out of the straight pipe exhaust. Azariah disengaged the auger, unbuckled himself from the salvaged van seat, and climbed down the metal ladder. He met Sterling in the space between their two vastly different worlds. "Hughes," Sterling said, having to raise his voice over the deep, rhythmic thrum of the idling Cummins engine. "Sterling," Azariah replied flatly, wiping a streak of oil from his cheek with the back of his wrist. "You're a long way from the country club. Shouldn't you be out running your spaceships?" Sterling flinched at the jab, but there was no arrogance left in his posture. He looked at Azariah's filled grain trailers, then back to the rusted combine. He swallowed hard. his pride completely breaking under the weight of financial reality. "They're dead, Azariah. Every single one of my X9S is locked out by the manufacturer's software. They can't handle the moisture." Sterling pointed a trembling hand toward the ominous black wall of clouds approaching from the west. "That storm hits tomorrow afternoon. I have 4,000 acres of high-yield beans still standing in the dirt. If they get flattened, I'm looking at a 7-figure loss. Croft can't help me. Nobody can." Sterling took a step closer, his eyes pleading. "But you can. I watched you run this thing. It doesn't stop." Azariah stared at the man who had chuckled as Harrison Croft humiliated him just weeks prior. He felt a dark, satisfying surge of vindication. But Azariah wasn't a cruel man. He was a businessman who suddenly held the most valuable asset in the entire state. "My farm is finished, Thomas. I've got maybe another hour of cutting to do here. Then I'm putting this rig in the barn and sleeping for 3 days. "I will pay you," Sterling interrupted, his voice desperate. "I will pay you whatever you want. Name your price, Azariah. Just get that machine onto my property." Azariah crossed his arms, leaning back against the massive front tire of his combine. He thought about Richard Cole at the bank. He thought about Harrison Croft's smug smile. He thought about the years of scraping by, eating canned soup, and watching his wife stress over the electric bill. "The standard custom harvesting rate in this county is about $35 an acre," Azariah said slowly, his voice cutting clearly through the wind. "I'll pay you 50, Sterling offered instantly. "I wasn't finished," Azariah said, his tone turning into hardened steel. "You laughed in my face when I was begging for a lifeline, Thomas. You and Croft both. So, here are my terms. I want $150 an acre. I want a fuel truck dedicated entirely to my machine parked at the edge of your field. I want your grain carts waiting for me at the end of every row so I don't have to stop moving." Sterling blanched. "150, Azariah? That's outright extortion. That will cost me over $500,000. And if you do nothing, you lose $5 million when that storm hits." Azariah shot back without a second of hesitation. "That's the math. You like playing the corporate game, Thomas? Welcome to supply and demand. I have the only working supply of kinetic energy in Oak Haven County, and your demand is bleeding out by the second. Take it or leave it. I'm going to go eat dinner with my wife." Sterling looked at the imposing, terrifying silhouette of the salvage yard combine. He looked at the sky. He closed his eyes and let out a defeated, rattling breath. "Deal," Sterling whispered. "I'll have my lawyers wire the advance to your bank immediately." "Call Richard Cole at First National?" Azariah said, a rare, genuine smile cracking through the dirt on his face. "Tell him I'm clearing my arrears. And Thomas, tell Harrison Croft to send his tow trucks out to your fields. He's going to need to clear those green paperweights out of my way." Azariah turned his back on the wealthiest man in the county, climbed the ladder back into the open-air cab of his creation, and slammed the throttle forward. The monster roared back to life, blowing a massive cloud of black diesel smoke directly over Thomas Sterling's luxury truck as Azariah pivoted the machine, preparing to march onto the mega farm and harvest a fortune. By midnight, the procession moving down the center line of County Highway 42 looked less like an emergency agricultural operation and more like a mechanized military convoy heading to the front lines. Azariah Hughes's towering, rusted Frankenstein machine led the charge. Its massive, mismatched salvage tires devoured the asphalt, and its straight pipe exhaust spat rhythmic, violent bursts of orange flame into the pitch-black sky. Trailing nervously behind this roaring leviathan was a fleet of Thomas Sterling's support vehicles, heavy-duty fuel tankers, a half-dozen massive grain carts, and luxury pickup trucks with their amber hazard lights blinking. They crept along at 15 miles per hour, escorted by a monster. When the convoy finally turned off the pavement and reached the border of Sterling's sprawling 10,000-acre estate, the sheer scale of the crisis became starkly visible. Azariah engaged the crude halogen work lights he had bolted to his custom frame. The harsh, blinding white beams swept across the undulating ocean of unharvested soybeans, revealing Sterling's paralyzed fleet. Scattered throughout the damp, muddy rows, the $500,000 John Deere X9S sat completely dead. Their flawless green paint gleamed under Azariah's lights, but their digital touch screens were dark, entirely defeated by the rigid limits of their own protective programming. They looked like expensive, abandoned monuments in a graveyard of corporate arrogance. Azariah didn't hesitate to admire the irony. He gripped the heavy, unassisted steering wheel and maneuvered his groaning rig past the first stalled X9, the immense treads of his salvaged tires instantly churning the wet earth into deep ruts. He reached up, grasping the thick, unpolished steel lever that engaged the threshing system, and pulled it backward with every ounce of his upper body weight. The industrial roller chains screamed in protest as they grabbed the heavy cogs. The custom-built, solid steel chevron rotor, weighing nearly a ton on its own, began to spin. It drew immense, unthrottled power from the howling Cummins N14 engine. Azariah dropped the rusted header, its metal teeth biting aggressively into the damp, rubbery crop. The megafarm harvest began with a violent, earth-shaking crunch. Standing on the muddy shoulder of the field, Thomas Sterling watched in stunned silence, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his jacket to hide their trembling. His lead foreman, a grizzled, deeply tanned man named Miller, who had worked this specific land for over 40 years, walked up beside his boss. Miller wiped a speck of flying debris from his cheek, his eyes wide. "I wouldn't have believed it if I wasn't looking right at it, Mr. Sterling," Miller whispered. His voice was barely audible over the roaring, rhythmic thrum of the diesel engine echoing across the dark valley. "That crop is so wet it feels like woven rope. It's practically rubber. But that scrapyard rig, it's not just chewing it up, it's inhaling it. He's filling a hopper every 15 minutes. I've got all 8 of our grain carts rotating just to keep up with him." Out in the darkness, Azariah settled into a brutal, punishing rhythm. There was no finesse, no delicate sensor calibration, and no automated steering. There was only raw, unyielding mechanical momentum. The damp stalks that had instantly choked the modern combines were shattered against the heavy steel plates of Azariah's rotor, pulverized by sheer, blunt force. He drove in long, relentless lines, a solitary iron ghost marching back and forth across the sprawling estate, leaving perfect, empty rows in his violent wake. By dawn, the sky had turned a sickly, bruised purple, and the public relations nightmare for Croft Implement and Tractor was in full swing. In the center of town, Harrison Croft arrived at his dealership to find his meticulously landscaped parking lot overflowing. But these weren't early bird customers looking to sign high-dollar leases. They were a furious mob of local farmers demanding answers. The Oak Haven Agricultural Exchange Facebook page had exploded overnight. A local teenager had flown a drone over Sterling's property just after sunrise, capturing undeniable, high-definition footage of Azariah's $40 monstrosity flying through the impossible fields, while Croft's flagship machines sat hopelessly stuck in the mud. Inside his office, Harrison's polished world was disintegrating. His phone was melting down with back-to-back calls from panicked clients. Then the private line on his mahogany desk rang. It was Richard Cole, the senior loan officer at First National of Oak Haven. "Harrison," Cole's voice drifted through the receiver, trembling slightly, devoid of its usual practiced corporate warmth. "I just processed a wire transfer from Sterling Holdings directly into Azariah Hughes's account. It cleared all of Azariah's arrears and paid off the Hughes Farm's mortgage entirely. And Thomas Sterling just left me a voicemail." Cole paused, swallowing hard. "He's pulling his financing for next year's fleet upgrade across his entire operation. He says your machines are liabilities." Panic clawed viciously at Harrison's throat. He slammed the phone down, grabbed his keys, and sprinted to his branded F250. When Harrison arrived at the edge of Sterling's property, the sight was profoundly humiliating. Azariah's machine was now over a mile deep into the field, a churning, unstoppable cloud of dust, flying chaff, and black smoke marking its relentless progress against the impending storm. Closer to the road, Thomas Sterling was standing perfectly still next to one of his paralyzed X9s. He held a heavy steel wrench, casually tapping it against the pristine green paneling. Harrison threw his truck into park, leaped out, and jogged over. His crisp, expensive polo shirt immediately clung to his sweating skin in the humid, oppressive air. "Thomas, listen to me," Harrison begged, his voice cracking as he gestured wildly toward the stalled combine. "My lead software engineers are in Dearborn right now working on a proprietary patch for the moisture sensors. If you just give us another 24 hours to flash the onboard computers—" "Look at the sky, Harrison," Sterling interrupted. He didn't yell. His voice was dangerously calm. He pointed the heavy wrench toward the western horizon, which was now a violent, churning wall of charcoal and deep purple. I don't have 24 hours. I don't even have 12. Hughes has already cleared 1,000 acres since midnight. Your machines aren't just useless right now. They are officially in his way. Sterling turned to fully face the dealership owner. All the camaraderie they had shared in the air-conditioned showroom days prior was dead and buried in the damp soil. "Send your flatbeds, Harrison," Sterling ordered, his expression cold and unyielding. "I want these useless green bricks towed off my property by noon. If they aren't gone by the time Hughes finishes his current pass, I'm paying him extra to push them into the ditch." The physical toll of the operation was becoming incredibly dangerous. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Azariah had been awake for 36 straight hours, 20 of those spent strapped into the vibrating, deafening torture chamber of the open-air cab. Every muscle in his body felt as though it had been beaten with a hammer. The vibration from the heavy-duty semi-truck engine transferring through the rigid, unsuspended steel frame was compressing his spine. His ears rang with a high-pitched, incessant whine that cut through his industrial earmuffs. He was covered from head to toe in a thick paste of black diesel soot, pulverized dust, and his own sweat. Claire arrived at the edge of the field in their battered pickup truck. When Azariah swung the combine around to unload his massive grain tank into one of Sterling's waiting carts, he throttled the engine down to a low, rumbling idle and climbed stiffly down the ladder. His legs nearly buckled as his boots hit the dirt. Claire rushed over, ignoring the grime, and wrapped her arms around him. She handed him a thermos of scalding black coffee and a foil-wrapped sandwich. "You're shaking, Azariah," she said, her voice tight with worry, her eyes scanning his bloodshot, sunken eyes. "You're going to kill yourself out here. The farm is paid for. Sterling wired the money. You don't have to die for his crops." Azariah took a long, burning swig of the coffee, letting the caffeine shock his exhausted system. He looked up at the sky. It was no longer just dark. It was aggressive. The barometric pressure had plummeted so fast that Azariah's ears had popped. The wind was whipping into a frenzy, tearing leaves from the distant tree lines and carrying the distinct metallic scent of ozone. The superstorm was forming its leading edge. "I made a deal, Claire," Azariah rasped, his voice sounding like grinding gears. "I gave him a price, and he paid it. I don't break my word. Besides," he looked over his shoulder at the roaring, rusted beast, "she's not done eating yet." He kissed his wife's forehead, handed the half-eaten sandwich back to her, and forced himself up the steel ladder. But as he engaged the threshing system for the next pass, the machine protested. The sound wasn't the usual rhythmic, heavy clanking. It was a sharp, terrifying, metallic shriek that echoed off the surrounding hills. Azariah immediately slammed the throttle back, killing the power to the massive chevron rotor. He threw the transmission into neutral and leaped from the cab. Sterling and his foreman Miller, who had been watching from the fuel truck, came running over as Azariah dove under the heavy steel paneling. Heat radiated off the massive Cummins engine block like an open oven door. "What happened?" Sterling yelled over the howling wind. Azariah pointed his heavy flashlight into the dark, greasy bowels of the machine. The immense strain of the damp crop had finally found a weak point. One of the primary industrial roller chains, a piece of solid steel meant to haul giant redwood logs, had stretched under the thousands of pounds of torque. It had jumped its sprocket, bending a heavy tensioner arm in the process. "Chain jumped. Tensioner is bent," Azariah yelled back. "If I run it like this, it'll snap and take off my leg, or shatter the main drive gear." "How long to fix it?" Miller asked, looking nervously at the sky. Lightning suddenly spiderwebbed across the black clouds, followed by a low, bone-rattling boom of thunder. "Normally, a day in the shop," Azariah grunted, sliding a massive pair of bolt cutters and a sledgehammer from his toolbox. "Out here, give me 10 minutes and step back." What followed was an act of pure, desperate mechanical triage. Working inches away from the blazing hot exhaust manifold of the idling diesel engine, Azariah used the sledgehammer to brutally smash the bent tensioner arm back into a functional angle. Sparks flew as steel rang against steel. He burned his forearm on the manifold, the smell of singed hair and searing flesh mixing with the diesel fumes. But he didn't stop. Using a heavy pry bar and every ounce of his remaining physical strength, he levered the massive, grease-coated chain back onto the teeth of the sprocket. He hammered a new master link into place, securing it with thick, heavy-duty wire. He crawled out from under the machine, his face a mask of grease, sweat, and absolute exhaustion. He looked at Sterling. "Get your carts ready. This chain is barely holding. I'm going to run it until it disintegrates." Azariah climbed back into the cab. He didn't bother easing the throttle forward this time. He slammed it to the maximum stop. The Cummins engine howled, blowing a massive pillar of black smoke, and the patched chain caught, screaming in protest but holding firm. The first heavy, freezing drops of rain began to fall as Azariah plunged the Frankenstein machine into the final 500 acres. It was a chaotic, terrifying race. The wind was blowing at 40 miles an hour, violently swaying the heavy cab. Lightning strobed across the fields, illuminating the rusted monster in erratic, brilliant flashes of white light as it devoured the crop. Sterling's grain carts drove parallel to him in the adjacent rows, Azariah unloading on the move because he refused to waste the momentum of stopping. The machine was rattling violently, the patched tensioner screaming a metallic death song, but the massive, unyielding rotor kept spinning, shattering the wet stalks and spitting out the golden fortune. The wall of water was closing in, a grey curtain of absolute destruction marching across the plains, but Azariah Hughes was marching faster. Torrents of freezing water slammed into the exposed cab of the combine, instantly soaking Azariah Hughes to the bone. The superstorm did not arrive with a gentle warning. It dropped from the bruised, churning sky like a collapsing concrete ceiling. Gale-force winds, clocking in at over 60 miles an hour, ripped across the vast plains of Oak Haven County. The wind grabbed the remaining, unharvested soybean stalks and violently pinned them to the earth. Within seconds, the dry, dusty field was transformed into a treacherous, sucking quagmire of thick black mud. For a modern machine reliant on delicate sensors, the harvest would have been over the second the first drop fell. The onboard computers would have detected the drastic drop in traction, the sudden extreme spike in crop moisture, and the massive resistance on the header, and they would have severed power to the drive shafts to prevent damage. But the Frankenstein machine had no computers. It had no safety protocols. It possessed only the unyielding, terrifying brute force of the Cummins N14 semi-truck engine, and Azariah's absolute refusal to quit. Azariah's hands were completely numb, locked in a death grip around the heavy steel steering wheel. The freezing rain mixed with the thick layer of black grease and diesel soot on his face, stinging his eyes. Lightning tore across the sky in jagged, blinding forks, illuminating the apocalyptic landscape in brilliant flashes of strobe-like white. In those flashes, Azariah could see Thomas Sterling's massive grain carts sliding dangerously in the mud beside him, their heavy tractor tires struggling to find any purchase. The CB radio mounted to the makeshift dashboard crackled violently, fighting through the static and the deafening roar of the storm. It was Miller, Sterling's grizzled foreman, screaming from the cab of the nearest support tractor. "Hughes! We have to call it!" Miller's voice was laced with genuine panic. "The mud is too deep. My carts are crabbing sideways, and the wind is flattening the crop. The header isn't going to be able to pick it up." Azariah grabbed the heavy microphone, his knuckles white. He didn't key the mic to agree. He keyed it to issue an order. "Drop your speeds and lock your differentials, Miller. If you stop moving, the mud will swallow you whole. Stay on my right flank. I'm dropping the header to the dirt." Azariah threw the microphone down and grabbed the hydraulic control lever. He shoved it entirely forward. The heavy, rusted front header of the combine crashed downward, its metal teeth digging directly into the saturated, muddy earth. He wasn't just cutting the crop anymore. He was scraping it violently from the surface of the ground. The machine groaned in sheer agony. The massive, mismatched tires spun, kicking up towering rooster tails of thick mud. The Cummins engine lugged down, the RPMs dropping as the immense weight of the mud and the waterlogged stalks fought against the custom chevron rotor. Black, thick diesel exhaust poured from the straight pipe, a desperate flag of defiance waving in the hurricane-force winds. Beneath Azariah, the patched industrial roller chain began to scream. It was a high-pitched, metallic wail that cut through the thunder, the sound of forged steel being stretched entirely beyond its molecular breaking point. The makeshift tensioner arm he had battered into place with a sledgehammer was glowing with the heat of the friction, hissing violently every time the freezing rain struck it. "Hold together," Azariah snarled through gritted, chattering teeth, staring into the blinding deluge. "Just hold together for 20 more minutes." The final stretch of Sterling's megafarm was a nightmare of sheer willpower. The stalks were so wet they resembled soggy rope, and the mud was trying to suck the heavy iron beast down to its axles. Yet the overwhelming weight and aggressive design of Azariah's threshing cylinder proved unstoppable. It didn't care about the mud or the water. It functioned like a colossal wood chipper, violently inhaling the flattened crop, shattering the wet pods, and spitting a continuous golden waterfall of soybeans into the adjacent, sliding grain carts. 10 acres left. The tensioner arm bent another inch. Sparks began to fly from the side panel, illuminating the driving rain in flashes of orange. 5 acres left. Azariah could no longer feel his legs. His vision was tunneling, his body operating entirely on adrenaline and the primal, desperate instinct to finish what he had started. 2 acres left. The wind howled, threatening to tip the tall, top-heavy combine over entirely. Azariah steered directly into the wind, using the heavy engine block in the rear as an anchor. He hit the final row. He shoved the throttle past its heavy detent, demanding every single ounce of torque the salvaged highway engine could produce. The machine surged forward, devouring the last of the crop in a violent, muddy frenzy. As the final waterlogged stalk was pulled through the roaring concaves, the master link on the drive chain finally gave out. It did not break quietly. It exploded like a shotgun blast. The massive, heavy-duty industrial chain snapped, whipping violently through the side of the combine. It tore through the galvanized steel paneling like tissue paper, shattering the heavy guardrails and burying itself deep into the mud. Freed from the immense load of the rotor, the Cummins engine screamed, over-revving wildly before Azariah violently yanked the throttle lever back and slammed his hand onto the kill switch. The roaring mechanical heartbeat of the Frankenstein machine choked, sputtered, and died. Azariah sat perfectly still in the open-air cab. The sudden absence of the engine's vibration left his body tingling with a ghost-like numbness. The only sound left was the deafening roar of the rain pounding against the metal roof and the howling of the wind. Below him, bathed in the erratic beam of his dying halogen work lights, Thomas Sterling's multi-million-dollar crop was gone. The fields were bare, muddy, and empty. Every single soybean had been safely secured inside the sealed, weatherproof grain carts of Sterling's fleet. Azariah wiped a trembling, grease-stained hand across his face, letting out a long, ragged exhale that turned to white vapor in the freezing air. He had won. Morning arrived with a cold, pale light that illuminated the absolute devastation of Oakhaven County. The superstorm had finally broken, leaving behind a sky of fractured, bruised clouds and a landscape that looked as though it had been subjected to an artillery barrage. Across the county, the financial carnage was unimaginable. Thousands of acres of unharvested crops lay flattened in the thick, unyielding mud, completely destroyed by the water and the wind. For many of the local farmers who had placed their blind faith in the high-tech, climate-controlled, software-governed machines sold by Harrison Croft, the season was a total, unmitigated loss. Their pristine combines sat stranded in the flooded fields, their onboard computers fried by moisture or locked out by safety protocols that had doomed the very harvests they were meant to collect. But on the vast, sprawling estate of Thomas Sterling, the story was entirely different. His massive, climate-controlled storage silos were filled to the absolute brim. Inside the sterile, glass-walled office of Croft Implement and Tractor, Harrison Croft sat staring blankly at his computer screen. His crisp, branded polo shirt was wrinkled, and the arrogant corporate smirk he usually wore had been entirely erased. His inbox was a graveyard of cancelled orders and furious emails. The Oakhaven Agricultural Exchange Facebook group, which just days ago had been filled with mockery directed at Azariah Hughes, was now a digital mob demanding accountability from the dealership. The farmers had seen the drone footage. They had watched a $40 scrapyard build, powered by a semi-truck engine, save a fortune while their $500,000 investments turned into useless paperweights. The heavy glass door to Harrison's office swung open. Thomas Sterling walked in. He wasn't wearing his designer jacket or his polished boots. He wore a simple, heavy canvas jacket, and he looked deeply exhausted, yet profoundly relieved. Harrison stood up immediately, forcing a panicked, desperate smile. "Thomas, please, sit down. I have my regional manager on the phone with corporate right now. We are going to completely comp the repair costs for water damage on your X9 fleet, and we are working on a massive software overhaul." "Save it, Harrison," Sterling interrupted, his voice calm, cold, and devastatingly final. He dropped a thick manila folder onto Harrison's mahogany desk. "Those are the termination notices for my leasing contracts. I am pulling my financing for the next 3 years of fleet upgrades. Your trucks have exactly 24 hours to drag those green bricks out of my mud, or I am claiming them as abandoned scrap and selling them to Earl Miller for weight. Harrison paled, his hands trembling as he looked at the folder. Thomas, you can't do this. That contract is worth millions. You rely on our precision technology. You can't farm 10,000 acres with rusted junk. I nearly lost $5 million yesterday because your precision technology decided the grass was too wet, Sterling fired back, leaning over the desk. I don't need machines that think for me, Harrison. I need machines that work when I tell them to work. The corporate game is over. I'm hiring Hughes to consult on retrofitting my older models. We're going back to mechanical drives. Sterling turned and walked out of the office, leaving Harrison Croft completely alone in the silent, crumbling ruins of his dealership empire. Miles away, on the edge of the county, the Hughes farm was quiet. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden glow over the weathered farmhouse. Azariah Hughes had slept for 36 uninterrupted hours. When he finally opened his eyes, every muscle in his body screamed in protest. His back was stiff, his hands were covered in healing blisters, and a dark bruise stretched across his forearm where he had burned himself on the exhaust manifold. But as he slowly sat up, a profound alien sensation washed over him. He felt light. For the first time in 5 years, the crushing, suffocating weight of impending ruin was gone. He dressed slowly and walked downstairs. Claire was in the kitchen, a pot of fresh coffee brewing. She turned as he entered, a smile breaking across her face that brought tears to Azariah's eyes. She didn't say a word. She simply walked over, wrapped her arms around his neck, and buried her face in his shoulder. On the kitchen table sat a printed receipt from First National of Oak Haven. The mortgage was paid in full. The equipment arrears were cleared. And at the bottom of the page, in bold black ink, was a surplus balance large enough to completely secure the farm's future for the next decade. Sterling had paid the extortionate rate per acre without a single complaint, adding a massive bonus for the sheer, impossible speed of the harvest. Azariah poured himself a cup of coffee and walked out onto the back porch. The crisp autumn air was clean and cold. He looked out over his own empty, harvested fields, and then his eyes drifted toward the large wooden barn. The massive double doors were open. Inside, resting in the shadows, sat the Frankenstein machine. It looked horrific. It was caked in a thick, hardened armor of black mud, grease, and pulverized soybean dust. The side panel was completely violently shredded where the massive drive chain had exploded. The straight pipe exhaust was heavily heat-blued, and the salvaged front tires were nearly entirely bald. It was a terrifying, jagged, roaring affront to modern engineering. But as Azariah looked at the $40 pile of scrap iron that had saved his family's legacy and humbled the wealthiest men in the county, he didn't see a junkyard relic. He saw a masterpiece. He took a sip of his coffee, a slow, deep smile spreading across his face. He would fix the chain tomorrow. He would weld a new tensioner arm. He would grease the massive chevron rotor. Because next season, when the corporate giants rolled out their fragile, computer-locked machines, Azariah Hughes was going to be ready. And he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that nobody in Oak Haven County would ever laugh at him again. The dust finally settled over Oak Haven County, leaving behind a harvest season that would be talked about in local diners for generations. Azariah Hughes didn't just save his family's farm from the auction block. He proved that true grit, mechanical ingenuity, and a $40 pile of scrap iron could outwork the most expensive, computer-guided technology on the market. His rusted, roaring Frankenstein machine humbled the corporate giants, bypassed the banking algorithms, and left the local dealership utterly speechless. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't bought with massive loans and shiny new paint, but are forged in the dead of night with welding sparks, desperate hope, and sheer, undeniable willpower. If Azariah's incredible story of resilience, defiance, and mechanical triumph inspired you, please hit that like button, share this video with anyone who loves a true underdog story, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life farming dramas. Drop a comment below. Would you have the courage to build your own machine, or would you have walked away?